Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so the mysterious and unsolved. This interest in disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped hundreds of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. This episode was suggested by a listener, Emily. If you'd like to suggest a topic, you can find us on Twitter at Morbid Podcast and on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast. I love visiting historic places. The first time I went to Jamestown, one of the first settlements of British colonists in North America, I was in heaven. The reenactors, the reconstructed houses and shops, and most interesting to me, of course, the aura of history that surrounded the whole place. While I was there, some of the reenactors spoke of another colony, one that was established before Jamestown. However, this colony hadn't survived to be preserved. When I asked why, the reenactor replied that the colony had simply disappeared. That colony was called Roanoke, and it's known as the Lost Colony. During the late 16th century, England was on the periphery of Europe. Spain was the dominating force on the continent, supported and enriched by its New World colonies. England did its best to interrupt these riches from reaching Spain by enlisting privateers, basically government-sanctioned pirates, to prey upon Spanish ships. One of the most well-known of these was Sir Francis Drake, or as the Spanish called him, El Draque, the dragon. While he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth I for services to the crown, the Spanish accounts speak of him as no more than an infamous and bloodthirsty pirate. Of course, the Spanish had their own privateers seizing English ships, so neither country really felt too bad about attacking the other. However, the Spanish colonies in the New World, what we now call North and South America, seemed to be the key to Spain's success. Some Englishmen thought that England needed colonies of its own to challenge Spain's New World presence. They insisted that God himself had set aside the area north of Florida and south of the St. Lawrence River for England. The idea of building an English colony at Roanoke in the 1580s was that of Sir Walter Raleigh, a man favored by Queen Elizabeth. He proposed that the colony would provide two things to England: a foothold in the New World and a base of operations from which English privateers could launch attacks against Spanish ships. On March 25, 1584, Queen Elizabeth I granted Sir Walter Raleigh a charter for the colonization of an area of North America. Both the Queen and Raleigh hoped the venture would result in the discovery of England's New World riches. Raleigh began his task by sending an expedition group of 2 ships, commanded by Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow, to the New World. They took the route known to them at the time, sailing south to the Canary Islands of the northwest coast of Africa, using the trade winds to push them to the Caribbean, and then moving up the coast of North America. The expedition left England on April 27, 1548, and landed off the coast of what is now North Carolina on July 13th. They followed an inlet and discovered Roanoke Island, now called Hatteras Island, situated between the mainland and the Outer Banks, a series of sandbars off the coast of North Carolina. The 2 captains were enthusiastic about the island as a site for the English colony. They found it abundant in both flora and fauna, and with excellent views of the ocean in 3 directions. It was also uninhabited by the native tribes, which were rumored to be savage and violent. When they were spotted and approached by the coastal Algonquin tribes, the tribes were friendly and traded with the English. Barlow went as far as to describe the place as a Garden of Eden. However, it would later be discovered that his account oversold the island and the ease of setting up a colony there. Barlow and Amadas returned to England in 1584, bringing with them 2 of the Algonquin men they had met while visiting the village of Chief Granganimeo, and their descriptions of the perfect place to build a colony. In the end, Queen Elizabeth backed the venture, knighting Raleigh and allowing the new territory to be named Virginia in her honor. She also gave the venture financial backing and a ship called the Tiger. On April 9, 1585, the first colonial expedition to Roanoke was launched, this time with far greater ambitions. There were 5 large ships and 2 smaller ships, all of which sailed the same route as before across the Atlantic. Raleigh, being the Queen's favorite, was refused permission to leave her side, and instead of Raleigh, his cousin, Sir Richard Grenville, sat at the head of the colonization effort. Grenville was not an experienced sailor or colonizer, and his role in the expedition was due more to his social standing than anything else. Grenville's second in command was Thomas Cavendish, a younger man who would eventually circumnavigate the whole globe later in his life. The third corner of the leadership triangle was Ralph Lane, who was to be the first governor of Roanoke. With their leaders, 600 men were aboard the 7 ships, and 100 of them planned to remain at Roanoke. On their way to Roanoke, the ships engaged in privateering activities, lost one of the smaller ships, and built an entire new one. Though the sailors gained a lot of wealth in their privateering endeavors, the men who were to settle at Roanoke lost valuable time in which to set up their colony and prepare for the winter. There were mumblings of mutiny amongst the 3 leaders, Lane being the most vocal about the loss of time. Lane went as far as to describe Grenville as being tyrannical in his efforts to keep control of his own men. Finally, on June 26th, the fleet of ships arrived at the Outer Banks of North Carolina. The men noticed immediately that the place chosen for the colony was not the perfect Eden that had been described to them. Roanoke Island was surrounded by shallow sounds, making it impossible for larger ships to anchor within the protection of the Outer Bank. They discovered this the hard way when the Tiger was shoved up against the banks and almost sank while attempting to anchor. They were able to save the ship, but lost most of the food supplies meant to start up the colony. Due to this loss, Grenville had to change his original plan of using Roanoke as a privateering base. Instead of wintering at Roanoke, he and the fleet would sail back to England and return the following year. This meant that Lane and the colonists had to find a more suitable harbor and a site for the colony that was more conducive to privateering. The colonists constructed their new home using a village plan the English used often, called a bond village. This type of village included a main building enclosed within a fort. The colonists' homes were then built on the outside of the fort. Each night, the livestock would be driven inside the fort for protection, and in case of an attack from the Spanish or native inhabitants, the fort was large enough for all the colonists and the livestock to fit safely inside. It was the end of August by the time the colonists finished setting up their bond village, and once they were done, Grenville and the fleet sailed back to England. The colony's lack of supplies could have been remedied as soon as Grenville left, but luck was not on the side of Roanoke. Raleigh had planned to send a fleet full of supplies to the colony in June, which would have arrived shortly after Grenville left. But the Queen diverted his ships to warn other English fleets of Spanish attempts to seize English vessels near Newfoundland. When he returned home, Grenville dispelled the idea that Roanoke was a perfect place for a colony to the supporters of the venture. He brought some evidence of the fertility of the land in the form of several plants from the area, but also reported the lack of harbors. He did, however, quell the doubts of the supporters with treasure he had gained by seizing a Spanish ship on the return voyage. Unfortunately, this made the supporters of the venture think that privateering efforts were more profitable and more important than the colony, which did not bode well for the future of the colony itself. Back at Roanoke, the colonists understood the need to treat their native neighbors well. They were well aware of the atrocities the Spanish had wreaked on the native populations of Central and South America, and thus wanted to prove that the Protestant Englishmen were in no way as barbaric. Also, the colonists realized they needed to trade with the Native Americans in order to survive the winter. Therefore, they created laws to punish heavily those colonists who were in any way violent against the natives. However, many of the colonists were former soldiers who had fought against the Irish and trained to think their enemies as lesser humans and use violence and terror to subdue them. This way of thinking carried over to the colony at Roanoke. The colonists mistrusted the Native Americans and made potential conflicts more likely. Before Grenville left them, he had believed a silver cup had been taken by one of the Native American tribes and ordered his men to retrieve it. When it was not found, probably because it was never stolen to begin with, Grenville and his men burned the tribe's corn and their village. He believed the English must respond to any bad behavior on the part of the tribe with overwhelming force in order to show the strength of the English. What he really did was break down trade relations with the tribe. That was the state of things when Grenville sailed back to England with his fleet. It appears that, surprisingly, without him there were no conflicts between the tribe and the colony until spring. At first, the Roanoke tribe had valued the colony, as it brought them new and interesting items to trade with the surrounding tribes, raising their own status in the region. But as the year wore on, they supported the colonists more and more, and the colony became a drain on their resources. With the death of Grand Ganimeo, the colony lost its long-standing supporter. Grand Ganimeo's brother, Wingina, took up the war name Pemisipan in preparation for military engagement against the English colonists without their knowledge. Governor Lane continued to consult Pemisipan due to the colony's utter dependence on the Roanoke tribe. They planned to meet with the chief of the nearby Choanoke tribe, a man named Menetonen. Pemisipan tried to sabotage the meeting by informing the Choanoke of the English's plans, but the English managed to surprise and capture Menetonen anyway. They held him for 2 days before a settlement was reached, and the chief was traded for his son. Menetonen cooperated with Lane and told him of the resources in the surrounding area. Lane was particularly interested in one of the sites Menetonen spoke of. This site was probably the Chesapeake Bay, and Menetonen made the area sound attractive because it was close enough that the Carolina tribe could still trade with the English, but far enough away that the English wouldn't be a burden on the tribe. He also told Lane of the copper mines to the west, and said that the plan to attack the English had been Pemisipan's alone. Lane chose to head for the mines, believing they would yield copper or possibly gold. Either way, the ore would potentially enrich the colonists and their supporters back in England. Taking 2 boats and 40 men, Lane left the colony, relying on the Roanoke tribe to keep them all fed. When Pemisipan learned of the expedition, he sent messengers to tell the Choanoke guides that the English planned to attack them. Because of this, the villages along the route to the mines were evacuated and all the food and supplies removed, leaving the English with no food source whatsoever. Lane let his men decide what to do next, and they chose to continue toward the mines. But shortly after making this decision, they were forced to turn back, fearing starvation and attack from local tribes. When Pemisipan heard they had survived, he was surprised, but resolved to starve out the colonists in the coming weeks by cutting off all their supplies. This forced the colonists to break into groups and try to live off the land as best they could. This move further angered Pemisipan, and he formed a large military force that planned to capture and execute Lane. Lane, who was liked by Menetonen's son, Skiko, was warned of the attack. The English countered with a night attack on a small group of the Roanoke tribe that stayed near the colony. The next morning, Lane and a few others went to confront Pemisipan and talk peace, but instead they opened fire on the Roanoke. The chief escaped, only to be discovered and beheaded later that day. A week after the attack, an English fleet commanded by Sir Francis Drake arrived on the shores of the island. They had been at sea for almost a year, attacking Spanish settlements and ships in the Western Hemisphere. Being an unsuitable harbor for privateering, the colony was of little use to Drake. However, he still offered to assist the colony and gave them two options: food, clothing, and small boats, or the opportunity to return to England. Lane chose option number 1. Drake gave the colony 1 ship, 6 small boats, and enough food for 4 months. However, on June 13th, a storm hit the Outer Banks, resulting in the ships being dragged, still loaded with food and supplies, out to sea. Instead of returning, the crew of that ship decided to sail back to England, leaving the colonists in the same dire situation as before. Drake offered to give the colonists another ship, but instead, Lane begged him to take them back to England. Drake's ships left so quickly that 3 of the colonists who were scouting inland were left behind, as well as the many Spanish slaves taken during Drake's privateering activities. When Grenville returned to Roanoke with his supply ships shortly after the colonists left, he criticized Lane's resolve, but returned to England. He left 15 men behind, along with artillery and enough food to last them a year. It's not clear why he didn't abandon the colony. Instead, he planned to return and resupply them again as soon as he could. Upon their return to England, Lane and the other colonists published their accounts of the colony. These are really interesting and available to read if you can find them. The book I used for the majority of my research on Roanoke was History's Greatest Mysteries, The Lost Colony of Roanoke, edited by Charles Rivers, and it has many quotes from these journals. I highly recommend it if you're interested. This was the end of the first attempt to colonize Roanoke. The second expedition to Roanoke left the shore of England in 1585. The supporters of the venture were no longer excited or enthusiastic, but the venture proceeded anyway. This expedition was headed by John White, who had previously been at Roanoke with Lane. White chose settlers for his colony that he believed would help the colony succeed. Instead of soldiers, he brought families, married couples, and fathers and sons. Overall, there were 9 children and 17 women in a group of 110 settlers. They set out in the spring and anchored on Roanoke on July 22nd. When they stepped off the ships, they found that the colony had been razed to the ground. They also found a skeleton they assumed to belong to one of the men left at the site by Grenville. The tribes in the surrounding area were also far more hostile toward the colonists, going as far as killing colonist George Howe while he was catching crabs alone and unarmed. White sought to repair the colonists' relationship with the tribes. He sent a group of people to meet with them, led by Manteo, a Croatoan man who had gone back with Lane to England but returned with White. The Croatoan tribe, which White met with, wanted guidelines to be set right away, including leaving the tribe's corn alone. They also said that the other tribes in the area were hostile towards the English, especially Pemisipan. In their talks, they also learned the fate of the men Grenville had left behind. Pemisipan's men had attacked them, burning the colony to the ground. Several colonists had escaped by boat, but were never seen again. Though he knew the relationship with the local tribes was tenuous at best, White felt the need to retaliate against the Roanokes and Pemisipan for killing George Howe. He sent men to attack a village, but soon discovered the village was not part of the Roanoke tribe, but another tribe that was friendly to the colonists. At this dire point, the ships that had delivered the colonists were ready to sail home. The colonists insisted that White return to England and make sure the supporters of the venture didn't forget about them. They went as far as to sign a document that begged White to go and seek aid on their behalf. While he was away, the colonists planned to move their settlement inland. Worried he was making the wrong decision, White sailed back to England just as a baby was born to his own daughter, Elizabeth Dare. The baby girl was named Virginia, and that was the last time White ever saw her. While in England, White met with Sir Walter Raleigh and planned to return to Roanoke with supplies. Eventually, a fleet of 7 ships was assembled, and Grenville was again to head the fleet as it left in early spring of 1588. But the ships never set sail. The conflict between England and Spain had erupted into war when Spain sent its armada toward England, an army of 150 ships, 8,000 sailors, and 18,000 soldiers with the ability to crush the English and completely invade their lands. Despite the apparent might of this army, the Armada turned out to be one of the worst military debacles in history. It was defeated swiftly by the English and then decimated by storms. However, as it took all of England's available ships to defeat the Armada, the fleet reserved for Roanoke was commandeered for defense instead of sailing back to the colony. Finally, with the Armada defeated, White got permission to take 2 ships filled with supplies and new settlers to Roanoke in late April of 1588. To White's annoyance, the captain and crew of these 2 ships insisted on privateering on their way to the colony. One of the ships lost the food, weapons, and supplies it carried in a scuffle with a French ship. The captain was killed, and White, who was aboard, suffered 2 head wounds. After this loss, the remaining ship returned to England, and 2 weeks later another ship set sail, but had to return yet again due to similar circumstances. The power of greed can be astonishing sometimes. White lamented the inability of the ships to resupply Roanoke, and he continued to try and get a fleet to the colonists. In 1589, a new corporation was set up to support the colony, providing money and material, but still the fleet was not sent. In 1590, another ban on ships leaving England was set, due to yet another threat from Spain. At the end of his hope, White decided to ally himself with John Watts, a privateer and merchant who had 3 ships. White suggested that Watts might be able to get the ships and his business moving if the 2 men combined their missions. Queen Elizabeth agreed and allowed Watts to set sail. But when the time came to depart, Watts went back on his word. He refused to carry the supplies, but he would take White to the colony. Infuriated but at a loss of what else he could do, White left with Watts' fleet. Again, the trip was interrupted by privateering. The ships spent much of the summer in the West Indies preying on Spanish ships. It was not until August of 1590 that White sailed up the coast of North America. Once he reached the colony of Roanoke, however, he found it completely abandoned. The houses had been taken down. There was no sign of livestock or people. 2 graves seemed to be all that was left. At first, White was not surprised. Before he'd left, he and the settlers had discussed leaving the site and setting up a new settlement on the mainland. The colonists had worked out signals to communicate their decisions before White had left. For example, if they left due to an attack, they would carve a Maltese cross over the doorpost to signal distress. If they left to settle elsewhere, they were to carve the name of the area they planned to go to. White found neither of these signals. Instead, he discovered the letters C-R-O carved into a tree. Later, he found the full word Croatoan carved into the entrance post of the colony. The colony itself was overgrown with weeds, heavy metalworking materials scattered about, and houses in various states of disrepair. White concluded that the settlers had moved, taking all but the heaviest things with them. White's own belongings, which had been buried to keep them safe, were found torn and tossed about as if in a fury. This, White assumed, had been the work of the local tribes. Based on the carving of the word Croatoan, White assumed the settlers had gone to the village of the Croatoan people, one of the more friendly tribes they had had contact with. He and the crew boarded the ship to sail toward the village, but were waylaid by storms. The crew decided to go back to the West Indies to make repairs and return in the spring. However, the ships ended up returning all the way back to England instead. In the end, White was not able to conduct a search for the colonists at all. In fact, he gave up trying to return to Roanoke completely. The colonists were never again seen by Europeans. The Virginia Company, which founded Jamestown in 1607, searched for the Roanoke colonists, believing the settlers could help Jamestown succeed. When Jamestown was founded, the settlers were told stories by the local Native American tribes of light-skinned people living with the tribes along the Chesapeake Bay. Captain John Smith himself was told that they had seen people like them. Smith believed these people might have been the settlers of Roanoke. Another colonist saw a white-skinned boy with yellow hair amongst one of these tribes. The Jamestown leaders sent 2 expeditions in search of the settlers of Roanoke, but by late 1608 they had heard rumors that the colonists had been killed. The rumor hinted that the settlers had posed a threat and were killed by Chief Powhatan, the great leader of the tribes in the area. Samuel Purchas, an English chronicler, wrote that Powhatan had confessed to killing the Roanoke settlers, but that some had survived and escaped. The Virginia Company sent orders to find these survivors, who were rumored to be hiding around 50 miles from Jamestown. But the colonists of Jamestown never went looking for them. So what happened to the settlers of Roanoke? What did the carving Croatoan mean? Did they go to live with the Croatoan tribe on Hatteras Island, or were they attacked by them? Their disappearance has fueled much speculation since the colony was lost. The theory that the colonists were absorbed by the Croatoan tribe or another Native American tribe is a popular one. Investigation into this hypothesis is ongoing in the form of the Lost Colony DNA Project, which is based in Houston, Texas. However, the findings so far are inconclusive. Another theory is that the Croatoans wiped out the colonists, but if this were the case, White would have found some evidence of bodies or other forms of destruction of the settlement upon his return. So far, no archaeology supports this theory either. I suppose the bodies could have been thrown into the sea, but there would have been other evidence of an attack on the settlement. Another theory proposes a drought led the colonists to die off or disperse. Tree ring data indicates that there was an extreme drought around the time the colony disappeared. There was another drought of similar magnitude, which almost led to the abandonment of Jamestown. Though a drought could be the reason for the abandonment of the Roanoke colony, there is still no answer to what happened to the colonists themselves. There would be bodies or some other evidence, and there just isn't. One explanation for the lack of bodies is, of course, cannibalism. Evidence for cannibalistic activity has recently been archaeologically discovered at Jamestown, so why not at Roanoke? In combination with the cannibalism theory, some researchers propose that the colonists may have suffered from some type of sickness, and due to their already dire situation were forced to eat one another. However, cannibalism leaves evidence behind, as was the case at Jamestown, and there isn't any evidence in the archaeology of Roanoke. So what does the archaeology of Roanoke tell us? East Carolina University has a Croatoan project in which archaeological investigations of the area the Croatoan tribe inhabited are taking place. The excavations have uncovered a gold piece, a 16th century signet ring, possibly with the crest of the Kendall family, gun flints, and several copper coins at the largest of the Croatoan villages, about 50 miles from the old Roanoke colony. If the ring did belong to Master Kendall, one of the colonists who came over with Lane, it is the first material connection between the Roanoke colonists and the Native Americans on Hatteras Island. The actual site of Roanoke, however, is extremely deficient in archaeological evidence of a colony. This is thought to be due to shore erosion, and the dwellings may possibly lie under the water along with any artifacts. Funding, which is always an issue in archaeology, is being sought to investigate further. Max Brooks, the author of World War Z, speculated about a possible self-contained zombie outbreak at the colony in his book The Zombie Survival Guide. He's one of my favorite authors, and you should check out both of his books. Another less spectacular theory suggests the colonists gave up waiting for White to return and tried to sail back to England on their own, and perished in the attempt. Again, there's no evidence for this, or any way to prove or disprove it. Intriguingly, between 1937 and 1941, a series of stones with carvings that tell of the travels of the colonists and their deaths were discovered near the site of the Roanoke colony. These were supposedly written by Elizabeth Dare, the mother of Virginia and daughter of John White, and are therefore called Dare stones. Most researchers consider these stones to be a hoax, but others believe they are genuine. One paranormal explanation that has circulated involves a Native American spirit. The Croatoan people were rumored to believe that the island of Roanoke had a spirit that, if angered, would change those who offended it into animals, trees, and rocks. Those who subscribed to this theory believe the colonists didn't disappear, but were changed in this way. On the other side of this, it was rumored that the Croatoans said there was a depletion of forest life at the same time as the disappearances. Perhaps the spirit was angry in general and took out all life on Roanoke Island at once. The mystery of the word Croatoan seems to go beyond Roanoke. This same word has supposedly accompanied unexplained disappearances all over North America for centuries. It was said that in the days before his death, Edgar Allan Poe, in his delirium, whispered the word Croatoan. It was rumored to be scribbled on the journal of Amelia Earhart after her disappearance in 1937, carved into the bedpost of famed horror writer Ambrose Bierce before he vanished in Mexico in 1913, scratched on the wall of Black Bart the stagecoach robber's cell before he disappeared in 1888, and written on the last page of the logbook of an empty ship, the Carroll A. Deering, when it ran aground on Hatteras Island, very close to the original site of the Roanoke colony. The truth is, we may never know what happened to the colony of Roanoke, but that doesn't stop us from wondering and turning that wonder into art and media. A play called The Lost Colony was written by Paul Green in 1937. The play features Sir Walter Raleigh as he attempts to establish a permanent settlement on Roanoke Island. The play is based on the actual accounts and diaries of Raleigh. The play has been performed in an outdoor amphitheater located on the site of the original Roanoke colony every year since it debuted, and it won an Honor for Excellence in Theater Tony Award in 2013. In the second season of the CW series Supernatural, there's an episode that overviews the story of the lost colony. The theory is that a blood-transmitted demonic virus that causes violence and insanity and finally disappearance was behind the loss of the colony. The name of the demon that created the virus is Croatoan. Don't you love sci-fi? Other TV shows of this genre that reference the lost colony include Angel and Freaky Links. More recently, the 6th season of American Horror Story presents itself as a paranormal documentary series called My Roanoke Nightmare. If you don't want spoilers, skip ahead about 15 seconds. The couple interviewed for the documentary moved into an old abandoned farmhouse where they are haunted by the Roanoke colonists, led by the apparent wife of John White, Thomasin. A comic book crossover between Batman and Spawn called War Devil attributed the colony's disappearance to a demon named Croatoan, who sacrificed all the colonists in order to attempt to appease hell itself. In literature, Stephen King addressed the mystery of the lost colony in his novel Storm of the Century and It. Besides King, there are many historical fiction novels that are set in the Roanoke colony and support various theories on its disappearance. Just type Roanoke into Amazon and half the results will be historical or paranormal fiction. This subject really captivates authors and audiences alike. In film, there are many ventures into the mysteries of the lost colony, but I'll only name a few of the more recent ones. 2 of these came out in 2007. One, called Roanoke, The Lost Colony, imagines the role of Eleanor White, John White's daughter, as the leader of the colony in his absence after he returns to England. The other, titled Lost Colony, The Legend of Roanoke, takes a more supernatural perspective, where the colony is plagued by wraiths. A short drama in 2011 called Roanoke features 2 survivors of the plague of Roanoke doing their best to survive in the woods alone. A TV movie which aired in 2015 called Roanoke, The Search for the Lost Colony, plays with the idea of the Dare Stones and sees 2 Masons and a rogue archaeologist investigating the colony's disappearance. A film project that's currently in development and due out in 2017 is a horror film called simply Roanoke, in which the colonists battle paranormal forces in order to survive. I seriously can't wait for this movie. The Lost Colony of Roanoke is just that, lost to history. The answers as to what happened to the colonists are lost with them. That is what captivates us and sparks our curiosity. The Morbid Curiosity podcast was produced by HMS Lloyd. If you want to get in touch or recommend a morbid topic for me to talk about, you can tweet the show at Morbid Podcast or join us on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast. If you like the show, head over to iTunes and rate us or share us with your friends. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thank you for listening.